Good afternoon and welcome to Cinema Smackdown for Sunday, August 25th, 2019. You're listening to CJLO 1690. My name is Michael Brody. I'm joined today by Shane Simmons, and today we're going to be talking boats. Because nothing says cinema like boats.
Well, the sinking kind.
The sinking ship kind. Tell us, Shane, what kind of boats are we looking forward to in the next hour?
Well, this is inspired by a news story that hit this week, where someone went diving on the wreck of the Titanic for the first time anyone's been down there in about 14 years. And they discovered it is in a sorry state. The wreck is starting to collapse. It is a steel-framed ship in salt water, so it's been down there for well over 100 years at this point, and it's probably not going to last another few decades.
Yeah, James Cameron was unavailable to be reached for comment as he is inconsolably weeping.
Yes, this may cancel his plans for creating a James Cameron theme park down there.
Isn't it already a private James Cameron theme park down there? Isn't that the whole idea of the wreck of the Titanic?
The wreck of the Titanic is still technically owned by someone. But James Cameron has sort of put his squatter's rights on the Titanic to the point where...
you're mistaken about ownership. Didn't Bill Paxton die a couple of years ago? There's a series of in-jokes there, movie fans.
Well, maybe someone will find that stupid necklace Rose tossed into the scene at the end of the movie, and they'll be able to buy it out from under... I guess it's. I don't even know if the White Star Line still exists, but whoever got the rights passed down to them from the White Star Line, they're still technically. Although it is considered a graveyard as well, so there's been a lot of ethical issues about how much should be salvaged from the Titanic. They have brought up a number of artifacts from the bottom. There was, of course, a number of things that were fished out of the water when the Titanic went down in 1912. That's remained in museums, and, of course, not all the bodies went down to the bottom or got lost in the sea. Many of them are, to this day, buried in places like Halifax and New York.
Then there's also all the people still alive in that one air pocket in the
breeding down there for, yeah. No, there were a good number of survivors, but they are all dead now, including the one baby who was one of the survivors. She has since died of extreme old age.
Speaking of death in the Titanic movie, I watched that film, and I remember the very end of that movie is Rose goes to bed and goes to sleep and has a pleasant dream about everybody on the ship as the camera pans through all the actors, and I was like, well, it's one of those, oh yes, remember all the people who were in this movie little montage scene, never occurring to me that the point of that sequence was, yes, Rose just died. That is the end of that. I did not occur to me that was the message.
Well, at least she is reunited with her one true love, Billy Zane.
Hilariously, I mean, you've died. Welcome to heaven. The most harrowing place you have ever been is now recreated for you for all eternity. Is that the point that she actually does go to hell at the end?
I think she does go to hell because she threw that priceless necklace into the sea when it could have, I don't know, fed a country.
Yeah, fed a country of the type of people who were locked in storage at the end.
Oh, yeah, the poor steerage people.
Steerage,
yeah.
Thank you. Oh, that was an ignorant statement. Oh, well.
Well, we can't all be history nerds, so...
It is storage once you lock them in a cupboard, isn't it?
Well, it's storage when you end up in Davy Jones's locker.
Exactly. All right, so now that
yes.
we broached the topic of sunken ships.
Yeah, the point being that there are a great many sunken ship movies, and Titanic movies are unto themselves practically their own genre.
That's true.
Interesting point of trivia. So the very first Titanic movie that ever came out, I kid you not, 29 days after the ship went down.
So I take it was not a sinking film?
No, it was. It was called Saved from the Titanic.
So
rushed into production 1912. I imagine short. There weren't features at that time.
Was it Is it using documentary footage?
No, it would have been like a stagey recreation. This is a lost film, by the way. There are no copies of it left.
They just painfully recreated the entire ship at a 1-to-1 scale for the same price as building the ship.
Well, funny point is that a lot of Titanic-related movies were shot on a variety of steamers that were either similar to the Titanic or were actual, I guess, classified as sister ships to the Titanic. So none of them were quite as big, but a lot of them were reasonable facsimiles for the purposes of staging a film recreation of at least the events leading up to the sinking. And then, of course, the sinking would have to be done with a model because we didn't have James Cameron level CGI at the time.
I remember the good old days when there were models that looked real, as opposed to now when we have CGI that doesn't.
I don't know. I mean, some of the models. I would say one of the great benefits of model work in Peter Jackson's films, specifically The Lord of the Rings, is his use of what was termed bigatures instead of miniatures. So they were miniatures, but they were very large ones. And if you make your miniatures large enough, it does have that presence, it does have that scale, that feeling of detail and physics to them. Whereas if you see a number of the earlier Titanic movies, those final moments of the ship going down really kind of look like a toy going down in a bathtub.
Well, it's interesting to hear you play devil's advocate for miniatures when we all know what a non-fan you are of the original King Kong. How much you despise that movie and how it has no
don't mislead our audience. No, I am a very big fan of that sort of claymation, the Harryhausen films as well.
The stop motion, the claymation, anything that has a strange unreality and yet still feels.
The funny thing is, all that stuff was abandoned just when it was getting really, really good.
Absolutely.
Specifically, I'm thinking, this is a little off topic, but Dragon Slayer has a fantastic stop motion dragon, which was done with a process, I think they called it Go Motion, which created a motion blur to the miniature, so it wasn't just this herky-jerky, frame-by-frame animation. It did have a flow of motion that made it seem very realistic.
Well, I mean, I haven't seen Dragon Slayer in 40 years, and I recall it being pretty flawless looking.
I still think it's the best dragon movie ever made. And,
it is a wildly uncomfortable film.
Oh, I am such a tremendous fan of that film. I could blather on for the entire show about it.
And I mean, it does feature so many sinking ships. It's almost like a perfect crossover film. And yet, I think we'll save it for our Dragon Slayer episode.
It does ultimately have a sinking dragon.
I forgot.
That kind of counts.
I barely remember anything other than being not taken in by the lead character.
Okay, well, no, well, it's a date then. You rewatch that, and we'll do a whole show on Dragon Slayer.
Don't get me wrong. I love how bleak it is.
Oh, yeah.
I love how bleak that film is. I love the visuals of it. I just really am not a Peter McNichol fan. And trust me, if you've even seen a trailer for Ally McBeal, it makes watching Dragon Slayer a little rough at that point.
I don't know. Didn't he make Ghostbusters too?
He is essentially...
He is the shining star.
He's the Zool of one of the three, the gatekeeper type character who's just deranged and wandering around. I've also not seen Ghostbusters 2 since it came out.
Well,
so,
yeah. I mean, it's not the right Ghostbusters film, but he will always be my keymaster.
What else you got to talk about?
So, in the early history of the Titanic films, there were also two other films that came out in 1912, immediately after the disaster. One was a French film, one was a German film. Later in 1929, we got a film called Atlantic, which was based on the Titanic, but they couldn't use the name Titanic because the White Star Line threatened to sue them. They're still kind of protective of that particular disaster.
So they got threatened with the lawsuit prior to photography so that they didn't have to blur out all the names like in Phantom of the Paradise. If anyone's seen Phantom of the Paradise, they actually had to change the name of the record studio because at the last minute it turned out there was a record studio with that name. So there's these blurred out record studio signs and super close-ups of signs they made later to just kind of fill the gap.
I don't remember that because I was too busy averting my eyes from the screen, so I didn't have to look at Paul Williams.
I like Paul Williams.
He's a bit creepy. He's a little creepy dude.
he's playing the creepiest man in the world in that film. It's kind of perfect.
Yeah.
He is a little tiny though to be that impressive in the movie. So it's a very funny thing where he's got a lot of power in that movie. And then you cut to him and he's Kermit the Frog sized. So it's a little bizarre. But that movie's not about sinking ships either.
No. Also early in the Titanic film history, we have Cavalcade from 1933, which has a Titanic segment of it. It's based on a Noel Coward play. It did go on to win Best Picture, but it was not...
you said it's called Cavalcade?
Cavalcade, yes.
That's a new one to me.
So yeah, one of two pictures to win Best Picture featuring the Titanic. The other one being that James Cameron one, which I'm sure we'll get to.
I feel like we've said enough about that already. But
No. There's so much more to whine about when it comes to that film. So, the first really, truly interesting Titanic film that was a feature-length film that was all about the Titanic, earlier ones being shorts, lost films, or a segment of another feature film. But the first feature film that was solely about the Titanic was a 1943 German film called Titanic. Now, what does that year tell you? Yes, it was a Nazi propaganda film about the Titanic.
That's delightful and terrible.
Yeah.
Now I really want to see that.
Sponsored and overseen by Goebbels himself. Oh, yeah. So it featured a fictional German officer who was the true hero of the story, and placed the blame for the disaster solely on the feet of those nasty British industrialists.
It really makes you wonder why Tarantino bothered creating a new fake pro-Nazi movie for Inglourious Basterds when he could have just used this. Sounds perfect.
Well, I guess there's not a lot of sniping happening in the Titanic Nazi film.
True, that was the point of the short film, but I love the idea of alluding to the real one and knowing that is just as outrageous.
Yeah. So yeah, interesting film. It is available on DVD. I actually have my own DVD copy of that particular film. It is an interesting historical artifact.
All right. Well, we'll be back to talk more about Nazi Titanic films after these messages.
Yeah, well, I guess James Cameron counts as a bit of a fascist if you're one of the poor bastards who ended up working for him. I'm sure Ed Harris would agree.
See, these are the you should have had that on the show. That's a great line. I mean, I get that Ed Harris thing. If you watch that documentary about how The Abyss was made, you're like, that poor man. 2 years of your life, like breathing underwater with claustrophobia and the whole thing, just to get that shot.
Yeah.
But I do love the movie, so it's worth it. It's worth it, Ed. Stop crying.
Why, yes, I am strong. Hey, big are you strong?
Meanwhile, Ed Harris was longing for the days when George Romero merely wanted to run him over with a truck.
Yes. Or bury him.
That was really him, by the way.
In a cemetery scene. What do you mean? Really?
Getting hit by the 18-wheeler. I'm absolutely that was Ed Harris for real.
That's your.
I'm sticking to that story.
The Paul McCartney of actors now.
Yeah.
He's been replaced by a double. All right.
Goo Kachoo.
And we're back on CGLO 1690 AM with Cinema Smackdown. I'm Michael Brody. I'm joined by Shane Simmons, and today we're talking about disaster films of the sinking ship variety.
And oh, the wacky things we talk about in the break. You can check out our YouTube channel for that under Shane Simmons, and look up Cinema Smackdown if you want to see all the nasty stuff we talk about while the commercials are going.
If you love your deleted scenes, and anyone who loves film should love deleted scenes, you might get a good earful of us commenting on actors' careers and or stranger titles than we're willing to bring up on air.
Yeah, some of it is legally actionable, so.
I think most of what we say on air is legally actionable. Luckily, our listenership they understand the pact between we and they is they keep it quiet.
Yeah.
And we keep these strange episodes coming.
What you hear about on CGLO stays on CGLO.
CGLO, where the entire audience is on the QT. All right.
So yeah, 10 years after the Nazis had their crack at making a Titanic movie, Hollywood had their first major take on it, which was surprisingly a 1953 film called You guessed it, Titanic. Very melodramatic.
That's the one, the big one.
No.
Another big one from a few years later.
No. The Titanic 1953 version is a bit of a footnote. Like I said, it's melodrama. It's about, well, let's follow some of the passengers and get into their personal business. And look, there's an entire ship sinking around them. I guess that'll help resolve their issues, as all that mass death tends to. Not a terribly notable film. The real notable one came out later that decade, 1958's A Night to Remember.
Oh,
that's the big one.
That's the James Cameron level budget movie.
Well, I would no. It was. It was the biggest Titanic movie made to that point, but it was still a British film, which meant modest budget compared to the Hollywood spectacle. But it did have something that's sort of fallen out of favor in style since then. It had a very docudrama narrative to it. The film I would most closely compare it to would be from a couple years later, The Longest Day, which is based on a Cornelius Ryan book about the D-Day invasion.
I remember.
And what the two films have in common is that they talk about this grand historical event in a very anecdotal way. So not only do they get the broad strokes of the event covered, but they also get down into the nitty-gritty of, and here's some of the weird stuff that happened. So A Night to Remember is not interested in having any sort of fictionalized romances or, love boat type themes. Oh, if only the love boat had sunk, that would have been an amazing final episode of that series.
I think it's still time to do a spectacular 3-part miniseries about the sinking of the love boat. I think its time has come. I mean, Aaron, what's his name? Aaron Spelling is gone. His daughter probably has control of all his properties. She doesn't seem too picky about what she finances.
I'm sure some of the cast is still alive.
I knew Gavin McLeod.
Yeah.
I on a podcast 2 weeks ago talking to the inimitable Gilbert Godfrey.
Oh, well, I would believe that an elderly Captain Stubing would probably run straight into an iceberg, even in the South Pacific.
Sounds good to me.
He'd find one.
I would watch the Hulu or Netflix version of this in a heartbeat.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Night to Remember, directed by George, is it George? George Roy Baker?
That's a guy?
Yeah. So he would go on.
A lot of the Hammer
Yes, exactly. He went on. Interestingly, he would go on in later years to do some of the more notable Hammer horror films, reminding me a bit of the career of another British director from that era and sort of aesthetic, who did another sinking ship movie, Sink the Bismarck, which was about the attempts by the British to sink the Nazi super battleship during World War II. That was directed by Lewis Gilbert, who, in later career, he would go on to direct 3 of the more over-the-top James Bond films. Specifically, You Only Live Twice, The Spy Who Loved Me, and Moonraker.
Yeah, it was nice when in the old days they had just 3 or 4 directors doing all the Bond films.
Yeah. So, interesting later careers for both those guys. So, A Night to Remember is probably still the most highly recommended Titanic movie. We'll get into some of the differing approaches to what actually happened, because it wasn't until 1985 that the wreck was discovered, and a number of new conclusions were made about how to depict the sinking of the ship.
Okay.
Because, just to get quickly through a few other films, there was The Unsinkable Molly Brown in 1964, which was a musical, Molly Brown being one of the survivors of the Titanic.
One of the most notable, as she has that memorable.
Yeah, she is. She's certainly depicted in a number of Titanic movies, larger-than-life character. In 1979, we had SOS Titanic, which was a TV movie and the first color depiction of the sinking. And then in 1980, we had Raise the Titanic.
That's the one I know. Yeah.
So this is based on the Clive Cussler book of the same name. It is a Dirk Pitt adventure, one of many that Clive Cussler wrote, and it is a universally panned film. It did not do well. It lost a lot of money in the day.
Unlike all the other Clive Cussler adaptations, which are beloved by all.
It was also, being in 1980, so 5 years before the wreck was actually discovered, it was the last film to suggest that the Titanic went down in one piece. The whole point of the plot is when they discover the Titanic, there's a thought of, hey, maybe we can patch the holes, fill it with air, and bring it back to the surface, which they ultimately do accomplish.
I mean, as we know now, to have truly happened.
Well, inevitably it was discovered that the ship had split in two at or near the surface and had rested at the bottom kilometer. I can't remember the exact distance between the two halves, but a good spread that would make any sort of salvage operation like that flatly impossible if it was ever even feasible in the first place.
I've never seen Rise of the Titanic, but I did just look it up quickly, and there is a cavalcade of wonderful character actors in this movie, including Jason Robards, Alec Guinness, if you want to call him a character actor, it's probably he's a little better than that. But Emmett Walsh. Now that's where you get into my wheelhouse with funny character actors.
I've seen the film once many years ago, and I remember it as not being as horrible as it is often remembered. But that's a faint praise on my part. I'm not a Clive Cussler fan. I actually read the book and hated it. I'm Clive Cussler. He's one of those guys who has consistently scuttled any attempts to make his books into films. There was that Matthew McConaughey film Sahara. In what year was that about? Like early 2000s? Yeah, something like that.
Well, in Raise the Titanic, you can see Richard Jordan doing his spot-on McConaughey impression.
Yeah. There is a giant amount of Dirk Pitt material that could be turned into an action-adventure series.
But like so many things, does it need to be?
Well, see, I liked Sahara. I thought it was a good James Bond substitute type of film.
I feel like Sahara is so terrible and yet has 5 or 6 moments that work. And everyone I know who doesn't hate that movie just clings to those 5 or 6 moments as, see how good this could be? It's like, well, it's not, though.
Yeah, the thing is,
terrible movie.
I thought it was a more fun James Bond wannabe film than many James Bond films of recent era.
Oh, so was the recent Girl with the Dragon Tattoo movie.
True.
What's it called?
Girl in a Spider's Web? Yeah.
Which was, again, a more interesting take on how to do an ongoing spy-type series.
Right.
Than what they've been doing for the last 30 years.
Anyway, Clive Cussler decided to kill that golden goose by doing nothing but complain about the film that they made from his book. Until they decided, well, we were going to make a series out of this, but screw that. We're not paying this dude anything else.
Oh dear. Well, that's not working, is it?
Well, go back to your hack misogynist potboilers, Clive Cussler.
It sounds like you're talking about Ian Fleming.
Yeah. You know, I actually found the one Dirk Pitt novel I read to be much more misogynistic than anything I've ever read in Fleming.
Right.
Although, James Bond side note, I will always say that the books are far less sexist than the movies. The women in the Ian Fleming novels are much more tough and capable than their film counterparts. It's not that the books are sexist. The problem with the books is that they're racist.
There's always a good category to fill at any rate for these. It's either the sexist, the bigoted.
Yeah, and you know me, I'm not one to complain about that sort of thing. It's a product of its era, but you know, the books do have an unearned reputation for sexism that I don't agree with.
Well, just keep in mind that McConaughey was not done making movies that had something to do with sunken treasure and or boats, as in 2011 he made a movie called Fool's Gold, which as far as I'm concerned is just a sequel to Sahara. Let's just pretend he's the same character. It works for me. It was 2008. Him and Kate Hudson were in that film.
Alright, so we ended up with a good long stretch of no Titanic movies until, of course, James Cameron came up with his super epic in 1997.
His can't lose thing no one asked for, that no one wanted. That
and that before it came out, the word was this is going to be a disaster of a film. It's just going to tank.
Colossal bomb in cinematic history because the price tag was over $200 million.
Yeah,
and Cameron knew going in he had failed completely. He was the laughingstock of Hollywood, and so in a bid to regain a little bit of his pride, he returned his fee for the movie. He gave back all the money he was paid to make the film, just to try to balance out what was sure to be the greatest box office bomb ever. And then the movie just did well and kept doing well for about 100 weeks.
Yeah.
And the box office just soared like mad. I don't know.
And they always say, "Oh, and it became the biggest film of all time." Exactly. Every time they say that, it's still, if you adjust for inflation, it will. The correct answer is always it will be Gone with the Wind as the most successful film ever made.
It played for 30 years. It played for over a decade off and on, and every penny of that box office counts. And if you adjust the dollars, it's not a 40-cent ticket; it's a $14 ticket.
Exactly.
So it really adds up. I mean,
yes, when it comes to butts and seats, that is the all-time winner. Right. However, Titanic did make a mint.
Yeah. I mean, by the same token, in modern-day television, you can no longer have a highest-rated TV show of all time because the audience is now splintered. So the last episode of MASH essentially and the last episode of Seinfeld will remain the most watched television ever. These are records that cannot be broken.
Right.
Because you can't get the entire world to tune into something anymore. Just look at the failing ratings of the Oscars as an example of people refuse to sit down and watch things when they air now. So you can't gauge.
It also doesn't help that the Oscars has absolutely sucked for years.
I disagree. It's getting better and better every year. Last year's host was by far the best host ever.
Oh, God. This past year was the first time, basically in my life, that I did not watch the Oscars.
Yes. I don't like that they've ground you down enough to make you give up. It's a sad.
Yeah, well, it's a combination of that and me cutting my cable. I would have cut it. I would have probably sat through it if I still had a cable connection, but...
All right, but you don't need cable when you've got CJLO 1690 AM. You're listening to Cinema Smackdown, and we are running down the hits, by which I mean movies in which boats hit things and sink hard. Something along those lines. Sinking ship films is our topic today, because, remind us, Shane, why are we talking about this again?
So, yeah, the Titanic has been revisited of late for the first time in a good many years, and it is collapsing in on itself. As a wreck that you can go down and visit, it really will not be much more than slag given another 20, 30 years.
It appears they have reached James Cameron for comment, and what he had to say was, sob. He's inconsolable. He's officially abandoned all the Avatar films again. They may be picked up at a later date.
Yeah, it should be noted, Cameron did follow up his Titanic film in 2003 with the documentary Ghosts of the Abyss.
Wait. That's the 3D one where they bring a camera
Yeah,
down.
they go down, yeah.
I have seen it.
Yeah.
And I saw it, I think, in 3D in the cinema before I abandoned the thought of ever seeing another 3D movie. That may have been the last one.
So, to talk a bit more about probably the biggest Titanic movie that will ever be made, it is a mix of really slavish recreation of the look and feel of the vessel and the artifacts, and a lot of details that are never mentioned anywhere else, and potboiler romance of the lowest common denominator.
And that's when James Cameron realized, if I write down, more people will come see my movie.
Yeah.
And he has continued that little formula ever since in everything that he's produced and everything he's actually written. That has been the basic, again, formula that Cameron's working with is, if I write the world's simplest love story and throw in a high concept but never have it pay off, then the lowest common denominator people will be able to sit through this along with everybody else, as long as you throw $150 million worth of special effects like this, everybody will see it, and I'll just get richer and richer and richer. It makes almost no sense when you look back at his early career and look at how smart his writing was. And one of the fascinating things about Cameron at the moment is that they just produced a movie that he wrote over 20 years ago, and the difference in the writing is notable. And it is the Alita Battle Angel movie, which is no masterpiece, but is significantly better. Conceptually, it's significantly better than anything he's done since around 94.
Mm-hmm.
And, which is, it's fascinating. I so wanted to hate that movie, the Alita movie, and I kind of like it. It is a charming.
Well, that's a fail on your part then.
Yeah, but I'm okay with it. I'm okay with it.
I expect you to be grouchier.
Oh, just, yeah.
I hate it when you actually see a movie you like.
Just don't bring up Avatar. You won't have to worry. At any rate, so tell me some more about Cameron and Titanic.
Yeah, so like I said, slavish detail. It is so meticulous in trying to recreate stuff in the film. It even includes the one car that was in the hold of the ship, and then it has to do it within the concept of context of a sex scene.
Draw me like one of your French girls.
Yeah, it's well, as someone pointed out at the time, and it's still a hilarious comment, that even in the North Atlantic, in the early days of automotive history, teenagers will still find the backseat of a car to screw in.
The perfect moment.
Yeah, yeah. Also, in the category of slavish detail, the chunk of wood that Kate Winslet buoys herself up on at the end of that film is an actual piece of wood, or a recreation of it, that was salvaged from the sea.
I mean, how could it not be?
Yeah, well, and yet that doesn't really serve the film well, because everyone who looks at her on that chunk of wood always goes, "Oh, come on, scooch over, there's room for Leo."
Well, my favorite detail about the Titanic movie that I only recently heard as an anecdote is the Neil deGrasse Tyson comment about the movie that he made a couple of years ago, where he said nothing but positive things about the film. Of course, he's big on promotion and saying positive. So he said, "Oh, what a wonderful recreation and such a timeless romance." And then you have that scene out in the ocean where the characters are shot in such a way that you can see the night sky very clearly, and it's crystal clear, and every star is in the wrong place, knowing what part of the world they were in and what year it was, and because you can track these things. So he wrote a funny little tweet or blog post about how the movie is so slavishly recreated except for this one detail. And James Cameron reached out to him and said, I hadn't considered that. We will fix it in any subsequent editions. And so for the Blu-ray of Titanic, they did in fact remap the stars, as it were.
Thank you, George Lucas. I mean, James Cameron.
Well, I feel like that's the kind of thing that no one will ever know you did, unlike, say, the movie E.T., where suddenly all the FBI agents have walkie-talkies.
Instead of guns, yeah.
Those guns are scary. You can't have them running around with guns.
Yeah, I'm not a fan of tinkering with a film after it's done.
Mostly I am not as well.
So, as I mentioned, Cameron's Titanic, it's the first film, given the new information they had after the discovery of the wreck, it's the first film to depict the Titanic splitting in half.
Right.
The thing is, I, as a history nerd, take issue with exactly how it's depicted. I think James Cameron went with going, oh, well, if we're going to do this, let's do it in the most spectacular, over-the-top Hollywood fashion possible.
Right.
Now, knowing as much about the case history of the Titanic as I do, I know that the whole reason the sinking of the Titanic was always depicted as the whole ship going down, and that race of the Titanic was a thing at all, is because eyewitnesses' reports at the time were mixed about exactly what the final moments of the ship were like. Whether it did split in half at the surface or not. There were some reports that suggested it might have. It's a little ambiguous because it was a moonless night, it was a glassy sea, there were no waves at all, and the power on the ship went out just as it was about to make its final slide under the waves, or lack of waves in this case. So it was very dark and hard to see exactly what was going on. However, there were survivors who were plucked out of the ocean who were on the Titanic right until the very last moment, including one of the chefs on the ship, who he is depicted quite extensively in A Night to Remember. He is also referred to in Titanic. He is actually on the back rail right next to Leo and Kate as they go down. They have a moment where they kind of make eye contact with this guy and have a, hey, historical figure who actually existed. Please ignore the entirely fictitious characters who are, experiencing the same thing you did for real. The reason he survived is that when he found out the ship was doomed, he went back to his cabin, got really, really drunk, and then ended up wandering out on deck, and he ended up holding on to the ship right until the very end. Incidentally, if you're ever on a sinking ship, especially a large ship, don't do that, because usually when a ship like that goes down, it creates a suction effect that will drag you down to the depths with it. This is an effect that did not happen with the Titanic. So literally people who were on a ship until the last moment were effectively able to step off the ship as it went under and just be in the water for the least amount of time, which helps you not die of hypothermia if you're in the North Atlantic.
Well, that's the fascinating thing about the movie Titanic. The DiCaprio character, as the ship is clearly starting to sink, he seems to somehow know exactly what to do to be a survivor.
Yeah, stay out of the water as long as possible.
He walks the audience through this whole concept as if to say, don't worry, I know what this is, how to work it. I understand physics, I understand temperature issues. It's very odd.
I am such I'm such an experienced seaman, even though I could only afford a ticket in steerage.
Yeah.
And have never been to sea before.
It's an odd way to walk your audience through the concept. He just keeps barking orders at Rose exactly how to behave.
He does have the benefit of nearly a century of hindsight backing him up.
Exactly. It just adds to the authenticity of Cameron's Titanic movie in every possible way.
Yeah, but the splitting of the ship depicted in the film is catastrophic. It is this massive, to the point where when the whole back half of the ship hits the water, that glassy water that was present at the time, it's impossible for me to believe that the departing lifeboats wouldn't have noticed this, if not been outright swamped by the splash created by this thing. I believe the splitting was a little more subtle than as depicted in this film, even though Cameron went to great lengths saying, no, this is exactly how it happened, except for my complete BS plot line. Everything else is so precisely about, how the ship went down. Look, it's great spectacle, and I do like the ship sinking in that film, but to this day, over 20 years on, I've still only seen that film the one time, because as cool as a sinking ship, and I love watching ships sink, there's just something about it that scratches an itch for me. I can't sit through that romance bull crap again.
There is a DVD that exists somewhere with about an hour and 20 minutes of deleted scenes, which I believe there may be a fan cut version of the movie out there somewhere, so that brings the running time to approximately 4 hours. I've watched a few of those deleted scenes. They're not terrible, but there's just a lot more of everything.
On a sinking ship fetish confession note, I will say on YouTube that there are real-time computer recreations of the Titanic sinking and the Britannic sinking. And I have watched those more than I have watched James Cameron's Titanic.
That's perfectly acceptable. I applaud you, sir. If only you could say the same thing about Avatar.
Well, I can say, again, I've only seen Avatar the one time, and it was enough.
It was enough after 8 minutes for me.
Yeah.
I watched the entire film, but I will say about 8 minutes into Avatar,
I cannot wait to not catch those 3 sequels pending.
I have to see the first one, not in the cinema for sure. If at all possible, I will not pay for it, but I have to see what he thinks. It's a movie everyone wants to see a follow-up to, that literally no one I have ever yet has said, I'd like to see more of that world.
Yeah.
No one. A film made for no... So I believe it's...
I believe Sigourney Weaver once said, I will cash another check.
Yeah,
but
she'll cash multiple checks. Even though she ceases to exist in the first movie. This is about as well thought out as when they brought back Agent Smith in the Matrix sequence.
I want the 3 Avatar films to be about the revenge of the rejected Mount.
All right,
if you remember that, it's like they create this life bond. It's like, oh yeah, once you tame one of these things, they're bound to you forever.
Horrifying sexual assault scene.
Yeah,
yes.
yeah, and then he merely upgrades to an epic mount, leaving his previous mount going, but I pair bonded with you forever.
Right.
No one ever really draws attention to this, but
it
is one of the greatest moments of animal cruelty in science fiction I've ever seen.
Sneaking in a level of assault unlike anything I have ever seen outside of a live slaughterhouse film. I am really, really not a fan of Avatar, to the point where I'd kind of be okay with all of James Cameron's films being removed from the space-time continuum, just so that didn't happen.
Mm-hmm.
And don't get me wrong, I like his 80s movies.
It is true. That is what the taming fucking Bronto scenes of any number of old westerns needed, was more sexual assault.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Well, not as uncomfortable as I was watching that scene.
Well, we need to fill for...
In IMAX 3D, no less.
I would so love to go to commercial right now, but we need to fill for about 30 more seconds before I can safely do that.
Well, for 30 more seconds, I will very quickly mention then 3 films: The Legend of the Titanic, Titanic, The Legend Lives On, or Goes On, I believe, and In Search of the Titanic, which were 3 animated Italian films about the Titanic, all of which are epically garbage. And feature happy endings and anthropomorphic animals, and everyone survives and lives happily ever after.
Yep. There was one of those probably retitled as Titanic 2.
Yes.
I saw the video release box for, and on the back in bold print it says, "Safe for children, no one dies, everyone is rescued."
Yay!
That's what it says. All right, we'll be back.
Take that, history.
We'll be back after these thoughts from our sponsors and station identifications.
It's back to school, which means it's time for the festival. From September 5th to 7th, enjoy 3 days of
It's Allison.
music and activities
It's Allison.
outdoors on
Chatting right now.
Oh, okay.
Fairly chatting. We were just speaking to her a few minutes ago. I do believe this is her voice coming over the radio.
So we're going to do an episode where we ask her, hey, what do you like and what do you hate? And let's make fun of it. Okay, cool.
And I'll double check with her and make sure I'm more keen on that, but that's fine. I spoke to her and another DJ who is interested in coming on, but at a non-specific date. So
Oh, who's the other one?
The other lady was very film. She was really into film.
Oh, yeah?
In fact, I spoke to two women at the DJ meeting on Thursday with horror. It's like, wow, horror movies, eh? Like that's my sweet spot.
Yeah.
Horror. I'm most interested in it. Oh, and the lady who was in the room beside her, she is a Once Upon a Time in Hollywood walkout. I was very impressed. All right, we're back. And we are back on CGL 1690 AM. Our show is called Smackdown. My name is Michael Brody. I'm joined by Shane Simmons, and we are running down the sinking ship movie hits.
And we've done damn near every Titanic movie.
That was a lot of Titanic movies.
There was another TV movie as well, and I'm blanking on it.
Are you really going to fill 14 more minutes?
No, I'm not going to do that. But I will mention the most recent Titanic movie that we've seen, and it is probably the most wonderful of all of them. I'm talking about the Titanic sequence in Holmes and Watson.
You know, I've liked that.
As well you should, because it is one of the worst cinematic atrocities committed in recent years. But if you want the historical accuracy of the Titanic being launched from London and attended by Queen Victoria, all of which just didn't happen. Wrong years, wrong location, wrong everything, wrong.
There's something to be said about doing it completely backwards. That is sort of like
there's nothing about that film that isn't backwards.
You like the first 10 minutes just like I did.
No, I did not.
You didn't like that scene?
I hated it from the first
I
seconds.
thought you liked the scene of him being an angry child, or at least the
Oh,
concept.
being tricked into kissing a donkey's arsehole.
Well, before.
Yeah.
At any rate, I thought that was the most tolerable part
or-
of that unwatchable movie.
Or a completely different beginning if you saw it in England.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it's a completely alternate opening sequence involving Holmes and Watson meeting as adults, and Watson trying to kill himself. And I
must fly to England immediately to track down a copy of this film.
It was playing somewhere. I actually saw a few seconds of this, and I'm not enough of a completist to give a crap about seeing deleted scenes or extra seconds
From your
of
least
this.
favorite movie of the decade.
Yeah, it truly is. As a fan of Titanic films and a fan of Sherlock Holmes movies, this one managed to affront me on two different fronts.
Oh, well done,
Yeah.
cinema.
Yeah, thank you, Will Ferrell.
That's the cinema smackdown against you.
Oh, John C. Reilly. If thankfully he came out with the Sisters Brothers to help redeem him this past year, because
I mean, that man has about 30 great roles.
yeah,
so it's,
yeah, and occasionally he just decides to do a really stupid, crappy comedy with Will Ferrell.
Well, I mean, it's really hard to understand. It's really nice to get paid. It's just so nice. It kind of doesn't matter what it is.
It is,
It's
but
really
at a certain point, do you not have pride and enough savings?
I know.
So, since we're talking about sinking ships, I have to mention the cycle of films involving the fictional ship Poseidon.
Oh, yes.
I'm sure we've seen.
Are there more than 3?
There are 4.
All right, let's hear
There are
it,
4
'cause I'm
total.
aware of 3 of them.
So there is a Poseidon Adventure in 1972. This is, of course, about a luxury ocean liner that is hit by a rogue wave and is capsized, and a handful of survivors try to make their way through the upside-down ship.
Yeah.
All
So it's an excuse to have a lot of upside-down sets.
basically
which is
trying
kinda fun.
trying to get to the very bottom of the hull and find a way out there before the ship sinks. This included an all-star cast, including people like Gene Hackman, Ernest Borgnine, Shelley Winters, and then it was produced by Irwin Allen, the master of disaster, who did The Towering Inferno and Earthquake, among many other 1970s disaster movies.
I mean, I haven't seen it in 25 years, but my recollection is the Poseidon Adventure is a good movie.
It's fun. It's trashy fun. It's based on probably what I would say was a better novel. And then inevitably they decided, well, hey, we have to make a sequel. So I will see your Gene Hackman and Ernest Borgnine and Shelley Winters, and I will raise you a Michael Caine, Telly Savalas, and Sally Field. And they made Beyond the Poseidon Adventure, which, interestingly, even though the Poseidon Adventure is kind of a sinking ship movie, the ship doesn't sink by the end of the film. It's still capsized and afloat. Beyond the Poseidon Adventure is about a group of salvagers who try to go in and get valuables out of the purser's office before the ship sinks. And indeed, by the end of that film, it does sink. It also sank at the box office because it is one of the most maligned films of the 1970s.
It does have one great piece of trivia attached to it. Sally Field was a massive star at the time of that movie, the most famous she'd been.
And Beyond the Poseidon Adventure sure fixed that.
And she was debating whether or not to do that movie, and Burt Reynolds was the one who ultimately convinced her to be in the movie, basically saying, it's the sequel to the greatest film of last year, the biggest box office winner. How can it fail? So you can absolutely blame... I mean, when did Burt Reynolds ever make a career mistake?
Well, actually,
right?
there was a pretty good spread between the two films. Poseidon Adventure was 72, and Beyond was 79. Irwin Allen directed the second one himself, and
wow, I
yeah,
didn't even realize that.
So
there's a vote of confidence.
exactly. So proving that for a director, he's a hell of a producer.
You gotta wonder when Kevin Feige's gonna start directing Black Panther sequels.
TikTok, it might happen. Then there was a TV remake.
That does sound vaguely familiar.
Yeah, in 2005 there was a TV remake. I haven't seen it myself,
I've
but
probably seen it.
we went from the all-star cast of the originals to the all-star cast of the TV remake, including people like Adam Baldwin, Rutger Hauer, and Steve Guttenberg.
Yep, there it is. It's 1 year
1 year before the
next
theatrical remake, which was called Poseidon, directed by Wolfgang Petersen. And I have to say, it's trash, but I'm a fan of that film.
Yeah,
I enjoy it
at all fondly. Isn't it just a beat for beat mostly of the same as the?
Well, it's no, not really. I mean, it's got
feeling like it had lower stakes. That's what I remember.
No, it has the most complex computer model ever created for a motion picture. It had like thousands of individual rendered little bits, so that the whole capsizing of the ship was pretty damn spectacular. And then it's an adventure led by Kurt Russell. How can you go wrong?
Because I remember thinking he was way less effective than Gene Hackman. He's playing the same part, right?
Essentially, yes. It's not literally the same part, but
I do not recall if it has the same.
It does
character arc.
No, it doesn't.
Because
no.
Hackman's character arc is what makes that movie work for me.
Yeah, Hackman's arc. He's a preacher seeking redemption in the original, whereas Kurt Russell is basically a guy trying to make sure his daughter survives.
Right.
And there is the element of sacrifice as well. It has Richard Dreyfuss as a suicidal gay man who is going to jump off the side of the ship until he sees that rogue wave coming, and then spends the rest of the film going to sometimes rather extremes to survive.
Right.
His arc's kind of interesting.
My recollection of it is very vague, only that I remember being much more engaged with the life or death situations in the original
Right.
Sudden Adventure, and in that one it was more of it just felt a little more hollow.
Well, it is essentially just the same concept repeated, but with all new characters, each on their own journey, and way more money and way more modern special effects to convince you that this thing's happening. And what can I say? We get a death scene involving Andre Braugher and Fergie.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's gone from my memory.
Yeah.
So thanks for bringing that up. What else we got? We got 5 minutes left. What else is on the dock for
well, I will mention briefly there was a Britannic TV movie, Britannic being a sister ship of the Titanic that went down in World War I after hitting a mine.
Man, those Titanic and offshoots.
Oh yeah,
farewell.
they're also doomed. We have The Last Voyage from 1960, which is loosely based on the Andrea Doria sinking. This one, an intense, I believe it's supposedly like a real-time 90-minute... I have to save my wife from the sinking ship before it all goes down. I tried to watch it for the show and was unable to procure a copy in time. We have the Ridley Scott film White Squall, which is sort of
I've seen it. It's the introduction to Ryan Phillips movie. He's a kid in that movie.
Right.
He's one of the must survive the tyrannical Jeff Bridges.
Yeah. You have to say you never put Lebowski in charge of a tall ship. It's just going to end in disaster. Inevitably, this does, and then it's all about playing the blame game about whose fault it is that the ship went down in just super horrible weather. And the last film I do want to mention is sort of an aftermath of a sinking film. One of my all-time favorites is Alfred Hitchcock's Lifeboat.
Right. Which is a masterpiece.
Yeah. A good counterpoint to the Nazi propaganda film about the Titanic. This one is an American propaganda film directed by a Brit, which is, I think, one of the most effective propaganda films ever made.
It's a whodunit to a degree.
It's not really a whodunit. It's about a group of survivors after a German sub sinks an Allied merchant vessel. A bunch of allies from different Allied countries get on the lifeboat, and the last one to crawl in is a German from the also sunken submarine. And it is a film that does a spectacular job of depicting the bickering that happens between the Allied powers, each represented by an individual on a lifeboat, and how the German manipulates them to follow, even though he's like the one, he's in the minority, but he is able to manipulate and in a charismatic way. That's the thing. It treats the enemy in this film as a guy who is often right, is very charming, is deceptive, but not really evil. But it is still a danger to them. The message being that we need to pull together as a group of diverse countries to defeat this common threat. Because if we don't stop bickering, he's just going to walk away with victory.
Well said, and really an excellent film. It does feature the greatest blink and you'll miss it Alfred Hitchcock cameo.
Yes.
Yes. I won't spoil it for people. It is brilliant. It is only beaten for me in his posthumous cameo in Psycho 2, which is also so delightful if you're a fan. And I never miss an opportunity to point out that Psycho 2 is a masterpiece of trash cinema. It is such an exploitation movie. It is so nasty and violent, and just it's an assault.
It makes the unpardonable sin of doing a sequel to a Hitchcock film, and yet earns its merit to exist.
It is something else as movies go. The sequel to Psycho is shockingly effective and such a product of its time as it is every kind of offensive now. It is deeply misogynist and deeply negative towards people with mental illness and so on. And it hits every possible button. Not to mention, wow, are those murders violent. They are more violent than anything in every Hitchcock film combined. Switch over to Psycho 2 and you'll see much nastier stuff go down. At any rate, we are about out of time. I'm Michael Brody. I've been joined today by Shane Simmons. We've been talking about sinking ship movies. Shane, don't you have a new book out?
Oh, I do.
What is it called?
It is called. It is available on Amazon and all Amazon outlets. It is called Epitaph. It is the sequel to Necropolis, my urban fantasy comedy detective occult thriller.
And if I'm not mistaken, there is a scene on a boat.
There is indeed.
There is indeed. That's
Yep.
the crossover.
The boat does not sink, though.
Every episode of a show, we should do one slight crossover to whatever we're talking about through your book. At any rate, thank you for having joined us. This show has been Cinema Smackdown. We will see you next week when our topic will be to be determined.
JLO 1690 AM in Joe.
Not a great failure, but not terrible.
JLO News.
Damn you for bringing up. Well, I brought him up Hitchcock towards the end, but I could have. No, because I was like, oh, I want to talk more about this. But let's do another hour now.
We certainly can, because Allison's here. We don't have a follow-up show. If you really want to do more Hitchcock,
Nah.
you want to do an hour on Hitchcock? I'm ready.
Do it another time.
Yeah, for sure.
Patients on stretchers waited on average 14 minutes.
If we had a need to fill hours of content, I'd do it. Yeah, we will have to come back and do more of these, so I guess save that passion.
Might as well. But we can do an hour of us banging on the drums. How about we do that?
In, what do you call it, in tribute.
Yeah.
Fallen comrade. I have been told we may not have to do him again.
Oh, yeah?
That might be it.
Oh, has he switched?
Stop recording though, I don't want to be
Yeah.
slandering anybody.
Right.